So the next thing I want to talk about is the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is set up a little differently than the brain. We're going to talk about the brain here, and we're going to look at the cerebellum as kind of an example. So remember that in our brain here, the cerebellum, you can actually see it, the white matter is deep and the gray matter is superficial. Remember the ventricles of the brain, they contain cerebral spinal fluid, and remember the choroid plexus is the structure that's producing that cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is going to be both in the ventricles, it's going to move through the cerebral aqueduct and eventually get into the central canal of the spinal cord. So when we look at the spinal cord here, there's a little hole right here in the center. You can see this canal here. That is the central canal. That is where our cerebral spinal fluid is going to be located. The other thing I want to mention is that remember that cerebral spinal fluid is both inside of the brain and the spinal cord, but it's also surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. Do you remember the three layers of the meninges? The dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. Underneath the arachnoid layer and above the pia mater is the subarachnoid space. We're going to have cerebral spinal fluid in both of those locations as well, around the brain and the spinal cord in that subarachnoid space. So we talked about gray matter on the brain. Gray matter is superficial, white matter is deep. On the spinal cord, it's actually reversed. The white matter is going to be on the outside and the gray matter is going to be more deep. And you'll notice that the gray matter kind of looks like a butterfly. And so we basically separate the gray matter and the white matter into horns for the gray matter and columns for the white matter. So when we look at this is anterior here, this is posterior. So the first thing I'm going to know is that these are horns. So we have a dorsal horn and a lateral or a ventral horn. The lateral horns are only seen in the thoracic part of the spinal cord. When we get into the cranial and the sacral and the lumbar, we don't have these lateral horns. We just have the ventral and the dorsal. Then we have the white matter. So the back part is called the dorsal column. The front is the ventral column and the sides are the lateral columns. And once again, white matter is made out of axons, mainly because it's myelinated. Myelination is made out of fat. Fat is white. Gray matter is going to be made more of those unmyelinated fibers and of the cell bodies, mostly those cell bodies, which is where processing is going to occur. The other thing that we have is you'll notice that we have these spinal nerves, right? So spinal nerve is here and here, and you'll notice that those spinal nerves split, okay? So they have a dorsal root and we have a ventral root. On the dorsal root, you'll notice this kind of chunky region, okay? That's the dorsal root ganglion. There's a bunch of cell bodies that are clustered in there, so it kind of makes it a little thicker. So when information comes into the spinal nerve and into the spinal cord, sensory information goes through the dorsal roots. It's going to come into and be transferred into the dorsal horn. And then motor information, once we process that information and send instructions, the instructions are going to come out of the ventral root and then into the spinal nerve. And what that means is that it's one-way informational flow. Sensory information comes in through the back, motor information comes out through the front. This is what we call a mixed nerve because it's containing both sensory and motor information.